Have you ever thought the world was coming to an end?
And it went like...
If so, you're not alone. For centuries, people have been trying to predict the apocalypse. February 1st, 1524, May 19th, 1910, and December 21st, 2012 were all dates penciled in for Doomsday. Either we keep getting extremely lucky, or Nostradamus, the Jehovah's Witnesses, and thousands of Doomsday cult disciples keep getting it wrong.
That's it. That's one.
But what if they simply missed the target? If they were all on the right track, but just miscalculated?
Watson, I'm beginning to see the plan.
I'd say we're currently on our way to a kind of downfall.
Humanity clearly is perpetuating an act of ecocide at the moment.
Are we closer to the end of the world than we realise? Did we just get lucky till now, and the apocalypse has been merely delayed? The end of the world is history's longest cliffhanger. It's been predicted at least 200 times over the last 2,000 years. That's an average of one doomsday prediction every 10 years.
It's true, numerous apocalypses have been announced and failed to show. It's interesting that the day after, no one can be bothered.
The belief in the end of the world, at least in the Christian parts of it, is tenacious. But why? It's connected to the history of Christianity.
The word apocalypse means revelation or unveiling. The theological origins are found in the last book of the New Testament, the book of Revelation by John.
Early Christian communities expected the world to end at any moment, and the prophecies piled up and into modern times. In the Middle Ages, making a prediction was good for enhancing prestige. Everyone got involved in the hunt for the exact date, including scientists.
They continued this attitude because they were devout believers still. So Isaac Newton, he used scriptural prophecy to predict when the end of the world would be. How long did he predict? 350 years. His theory of gravity has stood up, so let's hope that his prediction on the end of the world won't.
Knowing the exact date was important, so believers could prepare for the Last Judgment.
Although the apocalypse is unpleasant, it's fundamentally positive, because in the end, as a devout Christian, you enter paradise.
Several ends of the world later, we can take a more sober look, right? Because in the meantime, even this guy is under close observation. Space agencies are monitoring 2,270 PHOs, or potentially hazardous objects. Sometimes we know to the month when comets and asteroids will approach the Earth. But the probability of an asteroid causing a large-scale catastrophe is about 0.1% per year. Still, the danger is more real than previous end-of-the-world prophecies.
So, for instance, on January 1st, 2000, there was no sign of men from Mars coming to take us away. On the other hand, and I think it's equally important, the history of humankind is full of apocalypses that actually did happen.
True, for numerous civilizations and cultures, but also for many creatures who shared the planet with us humans, the world has ended. But
all previous collapses were local. Now we have a globally interconnected, high-tech civilization for which there isn't a precedent, impending reality of nuclear warfare or a worst-case climate catastrophe, yeah, apocalyptic would be the right word.
This is the end, my only friend, the end.
Indeed, the apocalypse looms overhead as never before. Fear of nuclear war or climate catastrophe is on the rise, and people react in very different ways.
The Doomsday Preppers are famous. They anticipate all kinds of scenarios, no drinking water or a complete blackout in the city. Another approach is to say we have to move away from capitalism. We don't need growth, but rather degrowth. Then there are those on the right who say climate change ideology is all just hype. It's all a big lie. It's nothing new. In some variants, there's a joyful anticipation of the collapse. It means the collapse of democracies as we know them, and the dawn of a new era.
Doomsday predictions are still made by scientists today. Since 1947, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists has been publishing updates on when civilization's final hour will come. This year, the researchers set their doomsday clock to 100 seconds before midnight. This is the closest since the Soviet Union's hydrogen bomb tests in the 1950s. Unlike back then, the threat today isn't only from nuclear overkill, but also climate change, species extinction, and the risks posed by artificial intelligence. For example, from its use in autonomous weapons systems and cybercrime. True, the doomsday clock is only a metaphor, not a real prediction. But is it possible to predict the demise of a society using modern scientific methods? These days, we can predict so many things: planetary movements, tectonic shifts, the climate. So why not the decline of our civilization?
Modelling societies is difficult, mainly because they're made up of people, and people's decisions are mostly made freely, at least to a certain degree. Some situations are relatively predictable. For example, when panic breaks out somewhere, there are very good models for how people will behave, where they'll run to. It's flocking behaviour.
Sociologists, economists and mathematicians have in fact been looking at the question of when our civilization will end for about 200 years now. Finally, in 2014, a model appeared that caused an especially big stir. The HANDI model, short for Human and Nature Dynamics. It doesn't sound dramatic, but newspapers like Britain's The Guardian commented that this model predicted the end of the world. The paper printed a collection of formulas. The irreversible type N full collapse meant the total collapse of a civilization. Is that what it is? The end of the world formula?
The HANDI model uses 4 variables. One is nature. Then there's the population with commoners, as well as a possible elite variable. And finally there's wealth. In the worst-case scenario, everything starts off pretty well. But now the population is growing slowly. Slowly, but it's very productive. It produces quite a lot of wealth, and that's to the detriment of nature. A few years later, prosperity peaks, but nature is almost entirely destroyed. And now the first elites appear on the scene. They consume but don't produce anything, so prosperity levels drop. But since the general population, which has since grown, no longer has as much to eat, the wealth decreases more rapidly. And nature, too, has been severely depleted, so there aren't that many resources left. The ordinary people have nothing to eat. Prosperity continues to decline. Hardly anyone is still producing anything. Of course, if nothing is produced anymore, the elites can't survive either, and eventually they're the last to die out.
Okay, Simulations are one thing, but is this doomsday scenario realistic? Can we use the model to predict the end of the world? If so, then when is it coming, the apocalypse?
Well, what would be a good month for the world to end in? It'd be nice to experience one final summer, so let's go for the end of the year. I mean, the whole point is we can't predict. No one knows when the world is going to end.
It's more about understanding how something like that could happen. What are the important factors? What factors would favour a doomsday outcome, and what factors could make it less likely?
That's why we speak of scenarios and not forecasts. But it doesn't mean we don't know where the journey is heading. We absolutely do know. It's just that we can't say on December the 31st, 2029, such and such will happen. This or that tipping point will be reached.
To understand a complex system, researchers pick out individual aspects. This lets them examine what keeps a system going and when it's in danger of breaking down.
For tipping points, you can imagine a coffee cup on a table. You keep pushing it a little farther towards the edge. At some point, it's so close to the edge that the slightest nudge is enough and it falls. Once it's broken and the coffee is on the floor, you can't ever get the same coffee cup back. You can't get all the coffee back into it again. You can't put it back together exactly the same way.
Simplified models and simulations like these help researchers understand what our societies might expect. In addition to the loss of natural resources or an upsurge in social tensions, there's another factor to consider.
Often societies tend to increase in complexity. That then develops a momentum of its own. You get an even larger administrative apparatus that was initially useful for organising work and creating added value. But eventually it mainly deals only with itself and no longer contributes additional value.
Unfortunately, the models can't predict exactly when something will occur. For a precise date, we'd need far more complex models, and we'd have to feed them vast amounts of data.
But the models don't help you understand anything. So much happens that all you can do is simulate the process like a black box in the computer and marvel at the result. It's practically impossible to understand what specific details led to this or that outcome.
Okay, but shouldn't it be easier with the past? After all, the past is over with, and it provides lots of factual data. Perhaps history could give us some insight into the timing of collapses. Do cultures have anything like a fixed expiration date? History is riddled with the rise and fall of civilizations. This cycle began about 6,000 years ago, when the first great empires emerged around the globe. They developed writing and calendars and ruled over vast territories and built stupendous monuments. They were Babylonians, Egyptians, Greeks and Romans. But then they perished, some without a trace, like the Anasazi in North America's desert southwest and the Nabateans in Jordan. The problem is that none of these collapses was like the next. But is there a pattern nonetheless? One of the most recent and popular explanations of civilization collapse is that of the polymath Jared Diamond.
As a biologist, he thinks of the world very much in ecological terms, and that's why he ultimately attributes everything to ecological mishandling.
By which Diamond means the overexploitation of nature has led to the downfall of various cultures, including the Maya, Anasazi, Rapa Nui, and the early Scandinavians on Greenland. Let's take a closer look at the latter. For 5 centuries, the Scandinavians settled on Europe's northwesternmost outpost, but around 1500, they suddenly and completely disappeared, leaving behind cowsheds, lots of cowsheds. According to Diamond, the Scandinavians turned Greenland's ecosystem on its head when they cut down all the forests to make way for cattle. Without the forests, the exposed soil eroded, and the Scandinavians' cows and sheep ate up the last remaining grass. When in the early 15th century, a mini ice age set in across Europe, the Greenland Scandinavians didn't even have the wood to keep themselves warm. they'd committed ecological suicide, ecocide.
The problem was the inability to adapt. Take the Inuit. They live several hundred kilometers farther north, yet they've adapted their way of life and economy perfectly. But if I, as a Greenland Scandinavian, am not willing to eat caribou and insist instead on having my cow, it all just collapses.
Many researchers regard the ecocide theory as a blueprint for civilization collapse, and it works astonishingly well. Hardly any place is farther from Greenland geographically, climatically and culturally than Rapa Nui, also known as Easter Island. Still, the collapse of this Polynesian culture is thought to parallel the developments in Greenland nearly 11,000 kilometers away in the Northern Hemisphere. It's hard to imagine, but the island, long since all but treeless, was a dense jungle at the time of the Polynesian settlement between 400 and 1200 CE.
One of the major narratives of how that collapse happened was the, kind of rapacious deforestation, the citizens of the island being kind of obsessed with erecting these, vast stone heads in the same way that we're obsessed with, erecting skyscrapers.
To move the giant stone statues, or moai, the Rapa Nui used bast ropes and ramps made of tree trunks. Lots of tree trunks. There are over 900 moai skirting the island, some up to 10 meters high and weighing 86 tons. At the height of Rapa Nui culture, there was practically a competition to have the biggest stone in the field. The outcome? Devastation. The forest disappeared, the soil eroded, the remaining wood was not even enough to make canoes for fishing. The island could no longer feed its inhabitants. The Rapa Nui culture collapsed. Within a few centuries, the population declined by almost 90%, from over 15,000 to barely 2,000 when the Europeans arrived. It was ecocide with eyes wide open. But if we're honest, aren't we on a parallel course? Aren't we headed straight into a global climate crisis? Researchers at Australia's Breakthrough National Centre for Climate Restoration have long warned the risk that global civilization as we know it will collapse by 2050 is quite real. If we continue as we are, with our CO2 emissions, deforestation and so on. Every year, about 13 million hectares of forest are lost worldwide, the equivalent of the size of Greece. Is the fate of the Rapa Nui a preview of our own demise? Not necessarily.
It kind of turns out that there's a good case to be made that it was kind of a completely different story.
The ecocide theory is compelling, but it has a catch. It's not historically watertight. In the case of Rapa Nui, archaeologists have discovered a societal collapse did in fact occur, and the forests disappeared, though it probably wasn't the Polynesians who were to blame, but this here. The Rattus excellans is a tenacious fan of civilization and a real pest in the Pacific area. Arriving on a new island, it's often encountered ecosystems that were entirely defenseless against it. With no predators, the gifted climber set to feasting on palm tree nuts and prevented forests from growing back. The destruction of the forest was truly an ecological disaster, but it probably was not what dealt the Rapa Nui their fatal blow. Apparently, they practiced an agriculture that was perfectly adapted to the climate.
It seems like the Easter Islanders were doing fine for a very long time, and it was actually European colonizers and eventually slavers that caused that collapse.
We don't know the exact reasons for the collapse of the Rapa Nui culture. What's certain is that both the slave trade and diseases introduced by Europeans decimated the population. By 1877, only 111 Rapa Nui were still living on the island. The ecocide theory is not the only model for explaining the collapse of communities. So why is it so compelling?
History is not telling what has happened. Each era tells its history on its own and goes by what that era happens to be preoccupied with. We project our own social discussions and fears onto past cultures.
It's always about why people interpret events as the end of the world, how they put one and one together and say, something's brewing here. In that sense, there's always a socially embedded act of interpretation, a narrative.
Put simply, every epoch has produced its own doomsday theory. It was often a criticism of contemporary events, which used history as a means to an end. The decadence theory, for instance, has been taking shape since the 18th century. It posits that ancient cultures like the Roman Empire perished due to corruption and moral decay.
Elites are decadent. As a result, the original greatness of our people has been dragged into the mud and come to fall. And now we have to fight against decadence so we can rise again to new greatness. That's the typical fascist narrative.
In the 20th century, biologistic narratives of decline emerged. Oswald Spengler saw cultures as organisms that blossom like flowers and then pass away again.
This was based on ideas of evolution at the time. It's so attractive, this idea that there's something inbuilt within a society or a civilization that creates it, kind of dooms it.
The theories are not entirely wrong, but they are often one-sided. They tend to focus on a very specific aspect such as war, poverty, disease or environment and climate. But is there such a thing as a holistic approach? What can we learn from history?
The road to crisis leads through a long series of small errors. It's the banality of ignorance. Often, it's a question of success. After all, we are successful, and the rest of the world should do as we do. So why should we change anything? It leads to a certain hubris. At some point, the difference between the world you're trying to hold on to and the world around you becomes so great that the whole thing explodes, and then society is finished.
To counteract this hubris, we could start by taking doomsday theories less as universal explanatory models and more as warnings.
We are indifferent to the apocalypse. We're jaded and numb. I think initially we need this apocalyptic narrative, but now it's not enough.
Open to the facts. Another reason we find it difficult to understand man-made climate change is connected to how we learn from mistakes. Our fundamental learning principle of cause and effect is of little use here.
Normally we learn if we put our hand on a hot stove, so to speak, we get burnt right away. But the climate crisis works differently. There's a considerable time lag between cause and effect. I put my hand in the fire 10 years ago, and my neighbour's hand gets burnt today.
This means that while some still see the world as just fine, others see it as already ending. Who will be affected and when? We can't exactly say. And now?
The uncertainty over the timing mustn't be used as an excuse for doing nothing. If anything, it should alarm us even more, because it could be very soon.
No one knows when the world will end. The only thing that's clear is that our own greatest threat is we ourselves. But it also means that we, humankind, have the ball in our court. We have a choice.
Well, I went to the doctor. I said I'm feeling kind of rough. Let me break it to you, son.